Good evening. Tonight we confront a tragedy that's shaken the world. A month back, Air India flight AI 171, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner bound for London, plummeted just 32 odd seconds after takeoff from Ahmedabad. 260 souls, including passengers, crew, victims on the ground. Dreams and futures were lost. Today, India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau has released its preliminary report, believe it or not, at 1 a.m. The findings are frightening. Seconds after taking off, both engines of the state-of-the-art jet shut down. Why? The fuel control switches, those critical switches that keep the engines roaring, were inexplicably moved from the run to cut-off position. In the confusion, perhaps there was an element of confusion. One pilot's voice, captured on the black box, demands, "Why did you cut off?" Cut off the fuel, in other words. The other pilot insists, "I didn't." Yet the switches were flipped, starving the engines of fuel, sending the plane into a fatal descent. Was it human error, a mechanical flaw, a known issue with these switches flagged by regulators years back? Did that go uninspected on this particular aircraft? No mechanical faults were found, yet the question leaves us with more questions than answers. Fuel samples were clean, the pilots were experienced, but something went catastrophically wrong. This is not just about one plane, one flight, one moment. It's about trust in the system that carry us across skies, trust in the airlines that we board, trust in regulators who are meant to keep us safe. The families of the 260 victims deserve answers, not ambiguity. The world is watching, demanding accountability. Was this a tragic mistake, a systemic failure, or something else entirely? Before we get on to all of that, let's just run through a couple of key parts of the cockpit of the aircraft which you need to be aware of as I describe what exactly took place. Let's have the images, please, of the cockpit. Let's start with the images of the cockpit of the aircraft, the 5 images before we come to this. If we can just pull those out in a moment from now so that we can go through those images before we talk about this. Can we do that? All right, those are just loading up. That's what I'd like to talk about first. But very soon we'll get to this so that I can offer an explanation of what exactly it is that we are talking about. All right, do we have those images up? Right, okay. This is the cockpit of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. It's a state-of-the-art cockpit, very, very advanced. What we are now going to be focusing on is this particular area. So let's go on to the next image, which focuses on that. That's the throttle quadrant. These are the thrust levers for the 2 engines. Pushing it results in fuel flow to the engines. It increases the velocity of the aircraft. Bringing them down decreases the velocity. And then, of course, there's the fuel control switch. This is what we'll be focusing on very, very closely. This is what went on to the cutoff position. The question is why? We don't have any clear answers. That's what we are discussing. Let's bring you another angle on these pictures. Again, this is the throttle quadrant. It's a twin-engine aircraft. 70,000 pounds of thrust, extremely powerful, developed by each of the General Electric Gen X motors. And these are the fuel control switches once again. Let's move to the next image. Another close-up over here. Now let's talk a little bit about the fuel control switches, because what you see here in this configuration is important, because there is no occasion when you switch the fuel control switches from the run to the cutoff position unless the aircraft is safely back after having landed and you need to switch off the aircraft. One of the only occasions when you might consider doing that, the pilots, is if there's an engine fire, then you switch off one. You don't want to switch off both the engines, typically speaking. But there was no engine fire in this particular case. So why did these fuel control switches, why did they end up go from the run position to the cutoff position? Secondly, it's not an easy movement of the switch. It's not that you sort of tap it down or you tap it up like this. There is a safety sort of inbuilt in the design of the system. You actually lift it and then you move it down. It locks into position over there, and then you can't just move it up. Again, you need to lift it, and then you need to move it up. That's the case for both of these units, but both of them are independent of each other, even though they are in this panel. So if there is a failure in that lockout system or the lock system in one, it doesn't imply that there is a failure in the lock system of the other. Now, let's just have that video out of the aircraft taking off, because I think it's important to describe for our viewers what exactly took place. Now, as the aircraft was taking off, and you can see that over there, it gained approximately 153 knots in velocity and speed. It took off, and just moments after taking off, there was that fuel switch which went to the off position, not one engine, but both engines. There was a brief communication between the pilots, one pilot asking the other, did you do that? The other pilot saying no. Then there was this desperate effort to relight the engines, and believe it or not, that was successful. One of the engines did spool back on power. They put the fuel switches back onto the on position, but that wasn't enough power to keep the aircraft out of this situation. It was simply too late, and the aircraft went and crashed. So again, these fuel switches were in fact pushed back on once again, but it was too late. There wasn't enough altitude, there wasn't enough airspeed, and the aircraft ended up crashing, as you will see in this video. Now, that's the point in which it was a point of no return. Some suggest, experts that I've spoken to, that if this aircraft was a few thousand feet higher, then they would have had the occasion of powering up the engines, and it would have actually flown away safely. Let's take a look at another picture which is important. This is a picture of the fuel switches once again. This is again what it should be looking like. Let's freeze this image if we can, please. And then let's take a look at these fuel switches. Freeze this image. And this is what was found in the debris. This is the actual image of the debris of the fuel switches. These fuel switches are now in the on position. A question that needs to be asked is if there was, for example, a mechanical defect as a result of which these fuel switches went from the on to the off position, then forensically in the debris which was found, they would look to see whether the lock mechanism was actually intact or had failed over here. If it was intact, then the entire theory that this actually went up and down uncommanded would be ruled, it would be ruled out as a possibility. Let's move to some of the other images that we have on the screen. This is the flap handle lever. Remember a couple of days back, in fact, shortly after the incident itself. Go back to the previous image if we can. I was talking about that. The flap handle lever, not this, the next one. If we can go to the next image. The flap handle lever, there was, yes. And let's freeze it over here, please, for a moment. The key point is, what are the flaps? The flaps are surfaces on the wings of the aircraft which need to be configured in a particular way to ensure that there's enough lift for the aircraft as it takes off. Some suggested, based on the footage, that the flaps hadn't been properly deployed, which is why the aircraft couldn't take off or climb out properly. However, this is what's been found, and the preliminary report suggests that the flaps were correctly configured. This is the actual debris of that flap lever. These are flaps 5. This is the appropriate takeoff configuration. So that's been ruled out. We don't need to talk about that at all. Let's go to the next image if we can. And that actually shows the landing gear lever module. This is important. This is what it looks like normally. And in this particular aircraft, the landing gear was extended. This is the debris. You can see that it remains in the extended position. The pilots at that stage were fighting for their lives, trying to get the engines back on. Therefore, they didn't get the gear up. And in that situation, one doesn't blame them at all for that. So we've got a couple of images over there. The key question which arises, and I'll talk about the digital flight data recorders that you see in this damaged condition in a little while from now. They were able to extract data from all of this. We'll talk about that in a little while from now, but I'm joined by Group Captain Jawardar, who's formerly with the National Flight Test Center. He's worked very closely on the Tejas aircraft. Wayan Sharma, the CEO of Times Aviation, and Captain Ehsan Khalid joins us as well. Let me go quickly across to Group Captain Jawardar. You were talking to me earlier on today, and you mentioned that there could be other factors which resulted in these engines losing thrust. And it's not enough to say that the switches moving or transitioning from the on to the off position is alone the explainer of why these engines lost power. So what could some of the reasons be?
Good evening, Vishnu. It is always a pleasure talking to you. However, today is a very sad day and a very sad subject on which we are discussing. However, I would like to tell you and your viewers about my personal experience. All right, we have enough spoken about this Boeing 737 or 787 air crash. I just want to tell you an incident which happened about 8 to 9 years back in the Air Force when I was still serving and I was posted in the headquarters. There was a case of a very modern aircraft ejecting very close to landing. All right, the preliminary investigation report as it came out right now directly pointed a finger at the pilots. However, there were lots of deliberation and further details which finally gave up the actual cause of the accident. And that was something was very strange. It was some stray voltages which was commanding an uncommanded ejection when the pilot was not pulling the ejection handle, but the aircraft ejected. So there was a lot of difficulty amongst people initially to even believe that such kind of a thing is possible, that without pulling the ejection handle, the aircraft can actually fire the seats. And while the deliberations were going on, subsequently thereafter, there was another case wherein one aircraft which was taxiing on ground suddenly had this kind of ejection. A series of tests were followed, and thereafter we realized that many aircraft had this kind of an issue of stray voltages which are coming on the system. However, they were not persistent enough to cause a trigger an ejection. All right, so this kind of events that have happened, especially now coming back to this situation that we are talking, and I heard you a couple of times saying that the switches were moved from run to cut. Mind you, I have gone over the inquiry a couple of times, multiple times, and every time I have read it, I have read only one word. It said transition from run to cut. Okay, so what does transition mean? Transition is a change of state. You would find the first reference of the transition when the report says the aircraft got airborne and the aircraft transitioned from the ground mode to the air mode. So there is a mode changeover that has happened that is being referred to in the transition. Page number 14, second paragraph, once again talks about the transition of the fuel switches from run to cutoff. It does not say, again, I want to reiterate, it does not say that the pilots moved the switch or they shut down the engines in these many words. Again, at about 10 seconds after this, once the RAD is deployed, it again talks about a transition from cutoff to run. All right, what is not very clear in this particular case is what this transition is referring to. What is that field, particular field of the flight data recorder?
No, so bottom line, what you're saying, just for the benefit of our viewers, you're saying that the use of the word transition doesn't necessarily mean that the switch physically moved from on to off. That's what you're saying.
Absolutely correct. That is exactly the point that I'm saying. And this can only be corroborated by the engineers, by the designers, or by the test crew who have designed
Perhaps
the system.
they just use the word transition instead
Yes,
of
that
using
is what I'm saying. The transition
from on to off. I mean, it could imply the same thing.
No, it may not imply the same thing.
Okay, hang on a second. Let me bring in Terry Tozer. He's a retired airline pilot who's been following this very closely. Terry, thanks very much for being with us. What is your reading of the report?
Well, the report is fairly typical of a preliminary report in as much as it states the facts that they've established at this point in the investigation. All they've really said is that the fuel cut-off switches presumably did cut off the fuel supply to the engines. They were then very quickly and correctly reset to the run position, which initiated a start sequence, which was successful. So basically, that part of the aircraft system was activated as designed. And the problem with all preliminary reports is they're just telling you what they found. They're not drawing conclusions from it. It doesn't answer a lot of the unanswered questions that we all still have.
What is your primary unanswered question, Terry, at this stage?
Well, as your previous speaker implied, can the process by which the fuel cut-off switches cut the fuel off be replicated without moving the switch? My understanding is that cannot happen. But of course, this is very early stages. The other question that we don't know the answer to is whether or not the latch system that prevents you from accidentally moving these levers was fully functional. They added a notice in the report from Boeing saying on the FAA saying that there is a recommendation that these should be checked to ensure that, because some have actually been deactivated. We don't know. All we know from the report is that Air India said that wasn't followed up on, but it doesn't mean to say that the latch mechanism was faulty. We just simply don't know.
Wayan Sharma, let's continue this line of, let's look at this a little bit closer. following up from what Terry Tozer said, and he's correct when he mentions that there was an FAA, that's a regulator, an American regulator, issued Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, SAIB, of the 17th of December 2018 regarding the potential disengagement of the fuel control switch locking feature, right? Now, this has mentioned in the report today as well. However, in the case of this particular aircraft, there's some important detail on whether or not the fuel control switches need to be looked at, in terms of whether that lock feature was working or not. The report says the scrutiny of maintenance records reveals that the throttle control module was replaced on VT-ANB, which is the registration number of this aircraft, in 2019 and in 2023. The fuel control switches, as I understand it, are part of that throttle control module. However, the reason for the replacement was not linked to the fuel control switch. There's been no defect reported pertaining to the fuel control switch since 2023 on VT-ANB. Therefore, this seems to indicate that the possibility of malfunctioning fuel control switches or the lock having not being operational, it appears to be unlikely. I mean, that's my reading of it. YN Sharma, would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I agree with you. See, there is an SB which says that due to vibration, or when you're, the aircraft is running on the ground, at that time, if the runway surface is rough due to vibration, you could have a situation where the switch may disengage from that. But look at the probability here. We are talking both the switches.
Yep.
Both the switches malfunctioning and slipping at the same time. That's literally a 1 in a billion kind of a probability.
Yeah.
It is, you have to, react to what are the facts on the ground as they unfold. If you recall, when I had come in when the accident had first happened, we just had a visual of the aircraft going down and we were speculating on what could be the causes. Now, at the preliminary stage, a lot of the stuff which was being speculated has now been put to rest. That, the gear is in a locked position, the flaps are correctly deployed, that, they're at 5 degrees, which they were supposed to be. All of that is sorted. Now, when you see the timeline, it says that the aircraft was developing absolutely the correct power. It unstuck from the runway when it was at about 250, 300 feet. At that time, it's according to the timeline, that is the time when both the switches, within a second or 2 seconds of each other, were disengaged.
Yes.
And after they were disengaged, the next thing in the pipeline is that on the CVR, that you have one pilot, we don't know who it was, whether it was the P1 interrogating the P2 or the P2 interrogating P1, asking, did you shut off the fuel? Right. And then they have tried remedial action, which is that they have immediately, the rat has come down automatically, which means that, the engines had, spooled down, which would happen when there is, the fuel is shut down. Then they have deployed both the switches. Again, the timeline between deploying both the switches is about 4 seconds apart, if I recall seeing the report and reading it correctly. And but then from that time onward to the time of impact is literally about 14 seconds out after they have deployed the switches. It takes a little while for the engines to spool up, and the data also says that only one engine had spooled up a little, but yet not developed enough power for them to fly out of trouble. So you have 6 seconds, 7 seconds before the crash is when the pilot, looking at that the aircraft is sinking, he is down to almost, by then he would be at about 100 feet or whatever, that he's going to crash. He's given out a mayday call, and 7 seconds later is when they've slammed into the ground. So the switches, now if it was a computer glitch, what would happen? I can understand that the computer sends the wrong signal and on the back end, there's fuel starvation, but it does not make the switches move. That would not happen. And even one of the theories which was going of some kind of an, outside interference or somebody taking over the aircraft or whatever, you can do that with the software. But this needs physical action by hand, which means whoever moved the switches in that position. And they were moved in the position. That is why the pilot called to the other one that did you move, did you shut off the fuel? Right. He did not say, if the switches were in the right position, what he would have said was that fuel starvation aircraft, the engines cooling down. He would not have given a call. He wouldn't have asked the second pilot, did you shut the fuel?
No, I take that point. No, you've articulated this really, carefully. Captain Ehsan Khalid, let me come to you first. Do you believe there needed to have been more in this preliminary report of the conversations in the cockpit beyond that one sentence or two sentences? And do you believe that, given the fact that the cockpit voice recorder is able to identify which pilot is speaking, because there are two sources, presumably, of audio coming in, pilot 1 and pilot 2, the report that was presented today should have actually said pilot 1 said this and pilot 2 said this, so that we would actually know what's going on in the cockpit a little bit better?
Okay, so what the question that you have asked, truly speaking, we should have had more information to make a correct judgment or make a correct statement of the actions of events that has happened in the cockpit. I have few observations on all the discussion that has gone so far, and I'll cover them point by point and briefly. Number one is fuel switch, its latch functioning, serviceability, and FAA SAIB of 2018. That is totally irrelevant to the issue, because the fuel run switch was found to be in the run position in the AIB report photograph. A switch that survives in run position for such a crash would not fail and be in that position. So that is self-indicatory that the switches were serviceable. FAA SAB of 2018, is not even mandatory for USA aircraft. So it is not even applicable to Indian aircraft to start with. What is more interesting thing is that FAA has come out with an advisory that is on 11th of July, yesterday, and even in that, they don't make that SAIB as mandatory for any of the aircraft in USA. There are 174 aircraft in USA. So that particular SAIB, I don't know why it was included in the AIB report. It is quite infructuous, because after going through 4 lines, they says it is not applicable. Now we come back to one of the observations which you made, was that pilot had a brief talk. Did you cut off or did you not cut off? It is itself questionable. That did they have a brief talk or did they have a prolonged talk? We don't know that. Okay, then we come to the question of Group Captain Jordar, who said that, transition and not moved, very technical point. I would just clarify that, when you are referring to fuel shut-off valve, the valve that physically moves to allow the fuel to come from the tank to the engine, that is referred to as transition. That means fuel shut-off valve transitions from off to cut off to run, or run to cut off. Fuel switch, in all probabilities and all the documents with all the professionals, are moved from this position to this position. AIB uses this particular word moved in only one circumstance, only one paragraph or one line, which is the last 3 lines of para 5. Coming back to fuel switch being recycled, we do not know the time stamp of when was it recycled. The biggest question right now is, was the fuel flow switch recycled in response to engine failure, dual engine failure, or was it the cause of dual engine failure? If it was the cause of dual engine failure and the pilot did go on to ask, did you do it? I know the time stamp, it has to be at around 50, 52 when it was put on. Why? Because you can put best of the pilots in the cockpit and give them dual engine failure. They will not know that the switch has been moved.
Okay. All right, lots of key points over there, Captain.
They would not
Khalid,
know.
Hold on a second.
Just 1 second. It is only when they come to memory item of dual engine failure and they say both engine failed, engine run switch off. Oh, it is already, do you put it off? No. Then put it on. That is the time that they would come to know that the engine run switch was off. If you see visually, you can't make out.
No.
There would be at least 20 warnings which were on. AIB report should have at least listed what all warnings were on, so that we would not be speculating right now, and the world media is speculating pretty harsh words for the pilots who were in the cockpit, which is what is very painful.
No, it is indeed very painful, but I do believe that the entire aspect of mental health and wellness of pilots is something that cannot be discounted. Nothing can be discounted at this stage. So it's not a question of keeping out information. It's a question of ruling out information. And this isn't to go after pilots. It's only to try and figure out what's in and what's out in terms of something credible. I spoke to Captain Mohan Ranganathan, one of India's long-standing aviation experts. And here's what he told me. I'll get your reactions, gentlemen, in a few moments. Do stay put. Is there any way in which fuel can be shut off to the engines of the Dreamliner other than the pilots manually switching off fuel by switching these from the on to the off position?
It has to be done manually. It cannot be done automatically or due to a power failure, because the fuel selectors, they're not the sliding type. They will always be in a slot. You have to pull them out and move them up or down. So the question of inadvertently moving it to off position doesn't happen. So definitely it's a case of deliberate manual selection. Only then you can move it to off.
Captain, when you talk about deliberate manual selection, it's deliberate manual selection, to use your words, in an extremely critical phase of the flight. Why would any pilot do that?
I don't want to use the word, but I've heard that the captain had some medical history, and it can happen. Nothing else explains why a switch with a takeoff point, just after rotation, both switches are moved one after the other to off position. It has to be deliberately done. Otherwise, if you listen to the voice recorder thing which they have said, the question one pilot asks, why did you do it? And the other pilot says, I did not do it. Now, this is where the report is showing some cover up things, because it's mandatory for all pilots to use their headphones for takeoff and landing. And it is not one pilot or other. It's very clear. The CBR will have either Cam 1 or Cam 2, the cockpit area mic. And if it's on the left side, it'll have Cam 1 recording. If it's on the right side, it'll have the Cam 2 recording. So by putting in a vague term like one pilot said this and one pilot said that is actually very poor reporting. And so the other thing, which is very clear from the report, they clearly mention that the captain was the pilot monitoring and the co-pilot was the pilot flying.
Yep.
So the pilot flying will have both his hands on the control column.
Yep.
Because he's rotating the aircraft for manual. It's not automatic. He's rotating the aircraft. He's till the climb, till he sets the autopilot. Both his hands are on the control column. So the pilot not flying is only one. The pilot monitoring is the only one whose hands are free. So to put in a vague term to mislead, I would say, to say one pilot said this and one pilot. So the action is deliberate. That is why I said it has to be manually done.
Captain Ranganathan, you said that there was a medical condition that you were aware of one of the pilots. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I've heard. That several pilots in Air India are reporting that he has a medical condition and he was also on medical leave for some time. So if the top management was not aware of that, I'm surprised, because many of the line pilots are aware of that.
So, Captain Ranganathan, you are very deliberately saying that one of the pilots deliberately switched off the fuel, knowing fully well that if they did it, there was a possibility of a crash. Would that be correct?
Absolutely.
Right. So, therefore, we are dealing with a potential pilot-induced crash. Is that what we're looking at?
That's what you're looking at. And I think that's what the authorities were looking at when they appointed a Director General of Police in that committee who knows nothing about aviation. And there was also a talk of sabotage angle. So when you put two and two together, it means they were aware of what was happening.
Okay. Now, assuming that you are correct, Captain, and and we both hope that you aren't. I mean, we don't want this to be at all, what the reality was. But assuming you are correct, what would the line of investigation be into this particular pilot? Would there be an effort to try and find out how they've been for the last few days, their behavior over the last few days, their wellness over the last few days? Would there be an attempt to speak to some of their colleagues, their friends, to know about their personal life, to try and figure out if there were any factors which could have induced something like this?
It is not last few days. They'll have to look at last few months to find out if he was on medical leave, what was the reason why he was on medical leave. All that has to be positively identified. Because I'm not an active pilot anymore, but if I'm getting these feedbacks from pilots who are there's got to be some reason for that.
Right, Terry Tozer, you would have heard Captain Mohan Ranganathan speak over there. He used the words deliberate manual selection. Is that something that needs to be looked at carefully?
Absolutely, it does. I mean, I think investigators will look at absolutely every possible explanation for what happened. My initial reaction was that this had been done quite deliberately by somebody, whether it was for the malign intentions or for some kind of mistake, I wouldn't like to say. But I think it's worth mentioning, I think one of the reasons, your last speaker was quite right to say that the investigators will know which microphone, which statement came from. And I think maybe one of the reasons that they've not identified one or the other is simply because they're still investigating. And we have to remember that this is a preliminary report. It's more of the what rather than the why. If it is to be something that is sort of out with the normal operation of an aircraft, like somebody's psychological state, that needs to be very carefully investigated. And already we see how difficult this is, and this must be both for the reputation of both pilots and their families, who now will be subject to all this speculation. And ultimately the full report will provide the answers. Sadly, that's going to take a long while, but I think that's why they've been quite circumspect in what they've said at this stage.
Group Captain Jawardar, I thought Mohan Ranganathan made one interesting point when, among several, one point that he did mention was that there's a Director General of Police, not an aviation expert, who's part of the investigation. Why would a person, and he's sort of linking one with the other, to make the point that why would a Director General of Police who's not an aviation expert be part of this body looking into a crash, other than the fact that he would perhaps be looking at the background of these pilots?
Yes, possible. And with due respect to Mr. Ranganathan, it is his perspective, and I may like to disagree with his perspective completely. However, as you said, that nothing can be ruled out. But I tend to completely agree with Captain Ehsan Khalid what he said, and I want to bring about a very important aspect for your viewers to understand as to when do we operate the switch. The fuel control switch is operated once it is put on. It is a mechanical switch. It is put on, it operates the fuel shut-off valve. As Captain Khalid said, it supplies fuel to the engine and the engine keeps running. When do you put it off? When you come back and when your flight is over, you are shutting down the engine and then you put the switches off. What happens when you put the engine switch on? This mechanical switch, when it puts on, it supplies a 28-volt DC. So when the DC supply goes to the aircraft, a signal is generated to open certain solenoids. So these solenoids remain open and thereafter the fuel flow continues. Now the question is, in case there is a situation which happens where there is an erroneous voltage or a stray voltage that goes to the engines or the FEDEC or the full authority digital engine control, which goes opposite to the sense of operation what is normally done, then what happens? So this is what is called the EMI EMC, electromagnetic interference and electromagnetic compatibility checks. I'm sure that Boeing has installed all checks possible for EMI EMC certification. However, like the example that I gave you in the previous example, which was also for a very responsible OEM, we found a very big flaw in an extremely important flight critical system. So my point is, at this point of time, while we can keep suspecting the pilots, it is very, very important for people to look into this aspect of EMI EMC. Last point. Has there been an event of a EMI EMC failure leading to a FedEx system fault? Well, there is a 2004 document, which is an FAA document I can share with you subsequently, written by Mr. Dave Wallen. And it talks about a helicopter, a single engine helicopter getting into an auto rotation because of an EMI EMC fault of a FedEx system. So I will leave it up to that for your viewers and for your investigating agencies to consider this fact and rule out this possibility before they can actually come back and point a finger at the pilots, and take this point of transition of the fuel from run to cutoff very seriously and very specifically.
All right, Group Captain, fair points over there. Thank you all very much for being with us.